I was thinking about, your whole concept about this idea of like life in transition, and
Mhm.
I really did have a crisis with my own identity.
Mhm.
And basically, I got obsessed with like Carl Jung, and I tried to, find myself, and through this shadow work and so on. You could say I sort of fell into the sort of pop Jungian psychology that Instagram and Facebook sort of just screams from above.
Javier, welcome to Manifesto's podcast.
Thank you.
Good to have you on board here. So yeah, we were introduced by a shared friend and contact, Cadell Lost, who talks a lot about philosophy. He did an interview with me on Nietzsche and Christianity. And I think you watched that, and then he sent me a link where you were talking about the conversation, and said like, hey, maybe you guys should have a chat. So we connected a little while ago, and I've been kind of exploring this theme of transition recently. People who are in some way, like, we're all in transition in our lives, but there's like major transitionary shifts happening in, certainly in my country, but in like, national geopolitics, and maybe even in the way that we, as humans are being in reality these days. And so I thought that there was so much juice in what we're talking about. So I said, oh, well, let's also have a little podcast interview and chat about that. So you're running a YouTube channel. You've just landed back or recently come back from military service. Do you want to just give us a little bit of background of where you are in the world and what you're doing, and also tell us a little bit about the YouTube channel that you're running and what you're trying to do there?
Okay, thank you. So right now, yeah, I'm in Arizona. I just moved here like 2 months ago, so that shows that I literally got out of the army about 2 months ago. I served for about 6 years. So now it's, everything's kind of, you kind of forget like how everything is kind of just given to you, in the army setting. Your healthcare is taken care of, your place to live, money, you don't really even have to worry about like any of those things. You could say the only thing that you have to worry about is just the job, just doing your job. But yeah, now there's a complete shift, right? Nothing is sort of, you could say has this confidence security, but now I finally have a job. So I work I work as a medical receptionist at a urgency care. So that's been great. I think it's gonna be like a perfect job for me to kind of go back to school. And I think that's another thing that has been really kind of causing some havoc, because it's like trying to pick a major, what is it that I want to do? I think we can always look at things and kind of just say like, well, I'm just moving to Arizona, but there always seems like something bigger is manifesting itself. That you begin to prod up, why am I in Arizona specifically? Why am I now wanting to go back to school? What is it that I really want to do now? And it does become like this debate of, is it that the jobs you want to find, is it going to be like your dream job? Is that what it boils down to, just finding your dream job, or is there something else? I think the way I answer that question is, in my opinion, it's probably very rare that you're going to find your dream job, so to speak. I think there's people that definitely have both, but I feel that you need something on the side. You need something that can sort of nourish you. Because I think putting like all your eggs in one basket for the job, being the nourishment and the dream and everything, is it's fine, but I just feel like it's a sort of rare thing that's going to happen. You can get discouraged.
What's your conception of a dream job? Like, what does that mean when you say dream job? Like,
that's a good question. So you could say like for example, my notion of a dream job would be like, I like studying a lot of religion, right? So off the bat, if you were to ask me, okay, Javier, just pick a major, like, don't care if you're going to make money or like survive or find the job at all. I probably would be picking something like religious studies. Um, I would love to do that, or, you know, something in the line of like philosophy. But, you know, it's this weird thing that you're like, okay, there's a couple nuances that I can take here. Either I can just go for it, and just kind of hope I do something with that later in my life, or I just kind of realize that I can just find a job that I don't mind doing and just do that on my own time, and sort of just fulfills anyways. Um, and then of course there's always the danger that actually doing the job itself can just ruin it for you. It's possible. um,
Mhm,
so
mhm.
yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of.
Yeah, yeah. What I'm hearing is like kind of balancing like a kind of your passion and then pragmatics of like, okay, well, I need to pay the bills and I want to establish, you know, a solid home and an income and establish a family maybe or something like that as well. And then can I just do what I really want to do? I just heard a talk between Jonathan Pisher and Jordan Peterson. It was like a Montreal talk. I don't know if you've seen that. They spoke a lot about like, they started talking about this problem of complexity and how, you know, there's an infinite way of interpreting texts and an infinite way, you know, there's infinite amount of data in any kind of scene or something like that, infinite complexity as well. And yet when as human beings, when we orientate in the world, we have this entire incredibly complicated kind of hierarchy of meaning. And so when we look around and orientate ourselves, then we automatically just see meaning. But then they go into kind of like, you need to have a top of the pyramid to be able to establish, you know, what's important and able to act in the world, because otherwise you're kind of like indecisive or aimless or even nihilistic or something like that, right? And so, you know, the way they talk about it, they bring in this concept of, you know, of God and say, well, what the hell is that? Says Jordan Peterson, of course, right? So we don't really know what it is, but like we wrestle with God or something like that. But I guess that's where, like, you know, it's something that we all have to face. And like, you know, I've certainly had long periods in my life where I've taken a kind of idealistic decision based on a theoretical idea of like, this is where I want to go, and like I'm going to trust that it's the right thing, and probably burnt myself many times with that as well, I guess, right? So I don't know. So what are you doing right now as you're in that situation, and you're still deciding what you're gonna major in and what you're gonna study?
So I actually I picked, this is a random one, right? It just feels random when I start, you know, telling about all the things that I do. I chose plant science. That's what I chose to do. But I don't know. I felt like that was a job that a field that I've never entertained at all. So it's actually kind of just in this realm of grayness that I won't be able to say, yeah, I wouldn't like that, or I would definitely like that. But so far it does seem interesting enough to me that it is very possible that I would like it. And I do have like this sense of balance where I feel like probably, you know, I wouldn't mind, you know, studying plants and stuff as my daytime job, and then, you know, at home I just sort of crawl away into all my religious books and stuff, and and do my channel. You know, I feel like that's a perfectly fine balance for me. Um, I think
Why plant science? Where did it come from? Like, do you have any
I
idea like how
I
that
well,
came on your radar
yeah,
at all?
there is some ambition in that. I mean, I guess you can see, like, I see the necessity now of you know, if we take like our cultural and environmental situation, I do feel like if we sort of use plant science to sort of, you know, solve some of the famine problems, or you know, how do we sort of go through the environmental problems with, you know, with plants themselves, you know, how do we make them more sturdy so that way we don't have a sort of a food problem, and what are the benefits of plants that are sort of already available that may be medicine. I mean, the thing that I've learned about being a nurse in the army was that when you give somebody a medication, there's strong side effects sometimes. And sometimes those side effects, you need another medication to alleviate that side effect. But that medication that you give to alleviate that side effect also has a side effect. So you're just going through a chain of medications. And I've recently learned about, you know, some type of plants is that they're not like that. They don't function like that. It's not like you get a side effect and you have to sort of give you another plant. It's not like that at all. And I find that actually very fascinating.
That's really interesting because I've just heard several conversations recently. Like this is the passion of technology, really. Technology is like you introduce some technology to solve some kind of problem, but then that new technology creates some new unforeseen problem, and so you need more technology to solve that. And so what we do is we just keep on, creating more and more technologies that create more and more complicated solutions. And but what you're saying is that there are natural kind of, we can return to looking at natural ecologies perhaps, or something like that, and see patterns or ways of being that can get out of that spiral or something like that.
Yeah. That is exactly what I'm kind of adamant about. Like, just kind of, I'm not like so adamant about it to where I'm like, oh no, let's get rid of medications completely. I'm not like that, but I do see that there is this balance of like, I think a lot of people have had bad experiences in hospital and medication we can present with them another option that is perhaps just as viable. So
When you say
I
plant science, like I initially thought you were like growing plants or understanding how plants work, but is this also for human consumption? Is this kind of like some kind of homeopathic?
Well, the plant science is a very broad sweep. It can go into botany, it can go into sort of medicinal plants, stuff like that, or it can go to sort of like agricultural, stuff like that, like helping the crops survive and get rid of pests and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a broad sweep, and I guess I'm still not knowing exactly what that like where am I going to specify in, but I think I'll probably figure that out along the way.
Well,
so
Javier, how about we try going a little bit further back then? I'm curious to hear a little bit more about where you're coming from. I certainly I found like that I get more clarity on the way forward when I look where I come from. So how did you get to Arizona, or like, and where have you grown up? Where's your family? And can you remember the first time you had this idea about plant science? Like, who planted that? What's the story behind how that first dropped into your mind? Yeah.
Okay. So I was born in Florida. When I joined the Army, I ended up they basically put me in Kentucky. So I was in Kentucky for about 6 years. I probably shouldn't have been.
When you joined the Army?
I was like 23.
Yeah. Okay. And what was your motivation for doing that?
So really interesting situation. There's a lot of things that happened, actually, sort of culminated in a big explosion. So one thing that kind of happened, it was like a kind of side remark that sort of got the wheels going. I was working at Panera for like 2 years before I joined the Army. And I remember a girl that had previously worked there, and I was kind of setting up the plates for the food and calling out orders for the customers to get them. And the girl that had previously worked there before, she saw me and she said, "Oh, you're still working here." And I'm just like, yeah, but the way she said it kind of really stung in terms of like, I should have been doing something more with my life. And yeah, ever since that time, that comment affected me, and that sort of got the wheels rolling. But it was not only that, it was at the time I had a roommate who was my best friend, and it wasn't panning out. It wasn't panning out because all of a sudden he had a girlfriend and she basically moved in with us. And the problem was, I'm thinking bills, right? I'm thinking she's also doing laundry. She's also consuming water, electricity, everything of that nature. And a big sort of fight manifested over, her having to pay some type of something for staying. But that didn't pan out. And, I was going to have to find a place by myself. I didn't want to move back with my mother. I was also at the time thinking about going back to school, but I didn't want to go into debt. So I think all those things sort of manifested in considering the Army and sort of what it had to offer.
And
then,
what
of
did it
course,
have to offer compared to other jobs, would you say?
Yeah.
or their career
Well,
path.
like now, I feel like now it's probably more competitive, but at the time I was, it did, like, I would say honestly, I probably would not have joined the army if I didn't get a good job offering to sort of train in. I instantly knew that if I was going to join the army, I needed something that was going to translate out of society. I mean, into society. So I
You
got
didn't want to just
lucky.
like be trained in killing Iraqis or something, like killing
Yeah,
Arabs or
exactly.
something like that.
I didn't want to just be trained by doing that. So luckily I scored high enough on my ASVAB to get this nursing position that was available at the time. And typically the way the army functions is that you can pick the job that you want to do, but you need to have the score for it, and it also needs to be available at the time that you want to join the army. So it's very specific in that manner. And then also, like, if you're physically healthy, if whatever the job sort of requires of you, if it sort of matches up with your physical constitution and stuff like that, like, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be able. Well, I probably could be a pilot, but at the time they were pretty strict on the whole eyesight thing. So, but that wasn't anything that I wanted to do. But yeah, so I chose nursing because I figured, like, okay, and plus my mother always told me to try it because she's also a nurse. So I'm coming from like a history of like medical. Everyone's in my family is like in the medical field, so there is that history of that. And so I figured at the time I was young, I was like, okay, I think it sounds good. Maybe I would like it too. But I quickly came to find out that nursing, even though I don't mind doing it, it's just not for me. And I also found out that the army wasn't something that I was going to make a lifetime. I quickly found I had sort of different ambitions.
Can we just cover as well, like, so you spent some time in Afghanistan as well.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about what that was like as well, and anything that really formed your experience of being over there?
Yeah. Okay. So I know there's some things I can't talk about, but I'm gonna try to talk about things that I can talk about. So I managed to get very close to the Afghani interpreters. And at the time I was Muslim. And so this kind of really shaped my experience completely. It was a very unique one because I think that was the first time I was able to do Ramadan as a Muslim ever in Afghanistan with the Afghani interpreters, which was a great experience. But at the same time, it was, very hot. I probably shouldn't have been fasting because the fasting, I don't know if you know, but the fasting requires not only abstaining from food, but also abstaining from water.
Until sunset. Is it from sunrise to sunset?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm abstaining from water as well, like the entire day.
Wow.
So I'd have to drink the majority of my water between, before sunrise and then after the sun has set. So that I thought that was a very unique experience that I had, and it was very hard. Let's say, I'm not gonna joke. Like, doing a whole month of that was probably the hardest thing I've ever done. But I'm very proud that I did it. It taught me a lot about myself in the sense that you could say I saw how ugly I was in the inside, which is not something that a lot of people just, like, I guess, openly acknowledge. When you have to sort of abstain from these certain actions and things to sort of maintain because, like, Ramadan isn't also just fasting physically. It's fasting from the things that you typically do. It's a spiritual fasting.
Also, the kind of behaviors that you use to distract yourself from feeling the discomfort
exactly.
of whatever it is, or your addictions or something like that, which allows all the unknown stuff to surface, right? Because we can't just go to the screen or whatever it is to distract us. Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. And was it just a month? I thought I had this idea that was 40 days in my head, but is it just a month?
I want to say I want to say it's about 40.
40
I'm
days.
not entirely sure because you have to follow like this the Islamic calendar, so it's completely different from like
Okay.
normal days. But yeah, I would say give or take 30 or 40 days.
Yeah.
It seems.
Okay.
Now the rest of my deployment, you could say, I worked as I was a part of a small surgical team essentially. So anybody that would come in that would be hurt, we would have to take in, and you know, if they required some surgery, I would help in that situation. Or if there was some type of emergencies, you know, we would be basically an emergency room and a surgical room at the same time. That's to kind of summarize what that was. I can say thankfully that I didn't have anything sort of traumatic happen. I was always fully aware that all those things could happen. I was definitely in what they would consider a combat zone. And I was definitely moving. I think within my time in Afghanistan, I moved at least 4 times. So there's always that risk something could happen. But I think that was also the time when COVID hit. So it also caused like a great stagnation. We weren't really getting a lot of patients, and I'm always actually very thankful for the idea, but there is that space of just like, well, then you don't know what to do with yourself. And I think that's where the problem of deployment comes in, is that you are always sort of confronting yourself, either through the loneliness or through others, meaning like there's just, you know, you're getting so close together, but at the same time you're getting irritated. You know.
I can certainly imagine like being on that kind of fast and then having to also be in a stressful situation, like an emergency kind of room with medical people coming in, and that's really you probably get to know yourself and the people around you in a different way as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then really interesting, COVID. Yeah, you never think about it, but yeah, I guess the war slowed down there as well. I saw pictures as well. I mentioned to you, I've been kind of like looking at some of this stuff that's been happening in Afghanistan. I saw like pictures with like all the Americans and Afghanis meeting, and all the Americans are wearing these masks. And I guess the Afghans must have thought this looks strange. These weird people.
Yeah.
I assume the locals there didn't care that much about COVID.
I think, yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I had some of the Afghani interpreters, like family members, die from COVID, but I don't think they were like, I guess, educated enough about how COVID actually works, how COVID functions. There was like this one concerning point where the Afghani interpreters were telling me that somebody in their village had sort of found the cure for COVID. I was like, really? And it was crazy because he showed me like the YouTube videos of this guy claiming that he found the cure for COVID. And it was so insane because I saw literally videos of people like lining up at this guy's house, just like so many of them. And I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, if this guy doesn't actually have the cure, then these people are going to get all infected and possibly die.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was, you know, an interesting part.
Okay.
But
can I go back to just so yeah, I actually wasn't aware that you had been Muslim yourself. So can you say where did that come from, and then what was it about Islam that you were attracted to, and then I assume you've also stopped, right? So, or that you're no longer consider yourself Muslim.
I don't
were you
consider
Muslim
myself
before you went to Afghanistan?
Yeah, I was. Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of things that sort of culminated in this idea. All I can say is that ever since I joined the army, you could say I was Christian nominally. And then I think it really sort of I really hit like this real point of like, you could say I really felt the nihilism going on. Where I remember at one point I thought I had really, I was in my barracks room and I was really thinking for a moment about ending my life. And then for some reason, I sort of took that as like the turning point for some type of change.
Mhm.
Because I think as I was young, I was always like chasing after, you know, certain women. And when they would fail, when it would just sort of kind of, I would fall on my face for these things. I was like, there's just got to be something more. Is there something? I'm obviously missing something. I'm
Mhm.
obviously not understanding something. And I sort of went on search for that. And so I had started looking into Buddhism, and Buddhism I was actually relatively content with. I think the problem was that I was so content with it that I was still like not understanding something. And then I had gone into Hinduism and stuff, and finally, I think some girl on Instagram messaged me. She said, if you're looking into religions, I hope you at least look into Islam before you consider anything. And I didn't even know what that was. I totally forgot that it was even a religion. At first I thought maybe Muslim was the religion. I didn't know. I didn't know anything. And I think for the first time I'd opened the Quran, and it just felt like it read like the Bible to me. So it was very weird, and at the same time, a little scary, because I was like, oh my gosh, am I gonna go back to believing in hell and heaven again? Like I just can't do this. You know, I went into Buddhism, Hinduism just so I wouldn't have to consider heaven and hell again. Um, but I think what was about Islam was that it sort of, I don't know, it was just fascinating to me. It was fascinating to me in terms of that there was different stories in the Quran. There was stories about Jesus that I've never heard of before. Like for example, there's a passage in the Quran where Jesus talks as a baby.
Mhm.
Or Jesus sort of does this thing where he takes I think was it clay, and he turns them to birds. Like this is like in the Quran, and I'm like, this is just fascinating. I've never heard these stories before. Um, and you know, there's stories about Moses that I've never heard before. Like I think one of my favorites is like Moses and Kadir, I think, which is just absolutely amazing. I would probably talk a whole video about it, how amazing that sort of like parable story is.
Can you give us a short
Um,
version of it? Because I haven't heard it.
okay, so yeah, the short version of it is like basically, I guess Moses, they give some context in the Quran, but they're saying that Moses claimed that he was the wisest, like of them all, and sort of like God sort of kind of doesn't like when he did that, and he says, well, I will show you somebody that is wiser than you. And so basically he ends up fighting this man named Kadir, and Kadir keeps telling him that he won't have the patience to bear with what I know, and Moses constantly pleads that what he knows. But anyways, they go through like a series of like things that Kadir does, and it's like insane. Like he like, you know, puts a hole in a boat, he kills a child, he you know, just does these weird things. And it isn't until the end of the parable that it sort of explains the foreknowledge that Kadir had. Like for example, he plucks the hole in the boat because actually there was a king that was sort of seizing all the good boats,
Mhm.
and so that sort of prevented the king from like taking the good boat because it was already damaged.
Mhm.
And apparently the kid was like gonna be like this horrible monster and like sinner and stuff, and right, you know, rain havoc on the parents and stuff. So stuff like that. So it was like a very fascinating
Mhm.
story about this sort of
Kind of saying something about
yeah. Go ahead.
how complex reality is, and how
Yeah.
we think we can figure it all out rationally and therefore be
Mhm.
good, but there's a divine element which, you know, I guess from especially Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic religions believe like there's a divine order to things, um, which we don't always understand, but there's
Yeah.
something else that's in control, I guess. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. I think for me, like Kadir really sort of nails it on the head of like this idea of like beyond good and evil that you couldn't like necessarily pin down. because if we saw anybody doing this, we'd be like, this is ridiculous. This man's obviously horrible. Like,
Yeah. I just heard a Russian author. There's a book called Laurus. The guy's name is Eugene, then some Russian surname. It's a fantastic book. But I heard him telling a story about like there was a bus driver who was drunk all the time, driving his bus, and then a priest who took his bus regularly or something like that. They both die, and then they kind of both go to paradise. And then in paradise, the priest is like, hey, God, like, what's this bus driver doing here? This guy was just drunk constantly, and like, he even has like a better mansion than me or something like that, right? Or whatever. And so God says, well, during your sermons, because he was saying like, yeah, I preached and I really like, I studied your word and stuff like that. And this guy, he was just drunk. And like, so he said, well, during your sermons, then everybody was just falling asleep while this guy was driving his bus, like if they made it to the destination or not, like they were praying the whole way. So he got people praying far more than you did with all of your preaching as well. So yeah, something about how it's strange how these things work out sometimes as well. Yeah, and I can say like my own spiritual journey has gone through lots of little twists and turns, one could say, of like some rather unlikely places, which were necessary for me, right? To get there. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, to kind of continue, I went to the mosque for the first time. I got curious enough to go to a mosque for the first time, and it was just a bewildering experience. There was no seats, it was just carpet. People were praying. I had felt inspired enough that I decided to pray with them for the first time without really even knowing what I was doing or how it all works. But I thought it was always sort of good to sort of involve myself in the movements and sort of the experience, really. And I think I converted that day, ironically. And I remember the guy sort of I guess swearing myself in. He's saying that, Jesus, you must accept Jesus as a prophet, and so on and so on and so forth. And at the time, I was just like, I had no problems with, accepting Jesus as a prophet. I think you could probably say I didn't have strong enough Christianity or, anything to be like, oh, that seems very no, that just seems very uncomfortable for me. But at the time I felt very comfortable with accepting, Jesus as a prophet. But I do think that it sort of gave a sort of very interesting view of Jesus, where I sort of entertained just Jesus as a prophet. And then there was this whole idea of Muhammad going on too, which was, all these other stories that were fascinating to me. But yeah, I think you could say deployment sort of made me really, I guess the best way to put it is I wrestled with God the entire deployment. COVID gave you that time to wrestle with God, you could say. Because I think I was quarantined in my room for like about a month, where it was just me in this room by myself. Wow.
And the only food that I would get would be the food that they would put at my door, and that was it. That was the only contact that I had. That was the only social interaction that I had. So it was literally just me and, wrestling with God and my sort of own passions and demons and everything else. And I think in some ways I sort of realized that Islam wasn't for me, and it took me a while to sort of get past that, because I'm not really comfortable saying that term, sort of like, oh, this religion isn't for me. So it gave me a sort of different perspective about how I approach religion. But also, I think the one benefit was that I could leave a religion without having any bitter taste towards it. And I think what I needed now, in some ways, was to reapproach Christianity or something else. But I think Christianity was a specific kind of factor where I was like, maybe there is a part of me that's a little bitter towards Christianity. And so I think that reapproaching and sort of relearning sort of opened my eyes. I think reading like C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, very basic book, but beautifully done. I think some of the arguments he poses there are probably still valid. I think actually some of the new atheists would have to sort of answer what the simple arguments that C.S. Lewis put down. I think they're sort of very fascinating. Yeah, I think trying to see the beauty and in religion again, because I didn't want to be sort of resentful about a specific religion or sort of hateful in some ways. Because I think if someone is sort of hateful or resentful about a specific religion, I in fact believe that they're still very much a part of that religion.
Mhm.
You know, I think I read once on Twitter that atheism is a denomination of Christianity.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some truth to that. Yeah, certainly like the new atheist rationalist movement, I think one could certainly make a very strong case for that being a nested system of thought within that developed out of the Catholic Church, basically, right? Like, I don't think it would have been possible outside of that. So, or at least not in its specific form. You can trace the history of ideas back where they came from, and it kind of like there's this, budding and growth, stretching out. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Thanks for that's fascinating. What and that process in your room by yourself for a month, that being in a foreign country, and that sounds like, one of the things that I think that we're faced with today is just the continuous distraction, and just things happening, especially living. I've just recently, a year and a half ago, moved out to the countryside, but I just like noticing how suddenly there's so much peace, and how suddenly, like now when I go back to the city, I just feel totally overwhelmed by the bombardment. Sorry, this is my wife calling. I put that on. But yeah, the constant bombardment from the city, right? Of just the advertising, like in your face all the time, right? And here, like out in this town, there's no advertising. There's a little shop down the road where you can see a couple little adverts outside, but like it's just I'm exhausted if I have to spend a day in Copenhagen these days, and so the fact that you got to spend a month thinking about what's really important, like, what is it that's at the top of my hierarchy of being, or hierarchy of value that I want to orientate my life towards, and getting really serious about that. I think, yeah, it's not something that's enjoyable, but I think it's probably something that's very valuable, right? Can I ask what it was that when you said like Islam isn't for me, like, was there something specific about it, or what do you think?
I think it was, I think it actually, to be honest, I think it demanded too much from me. 5 prayers every day. Not only you had to do 5 prayers every day, but you had to do, the sort of ritual, sort of, I guess, like bathing, like it was called like wudu. You sort of dip your hands in the water, and then you do it on your face, and then your arms, and then your legs. You sort of just, gently just do the water on your body before prayer. I mean, it definitely taught me the discipline of prayer. It taught me how to pray. I think that was something that I never got adjusted. Well, you could say that I felt there was something weird about the way I was raised. My mother just sort of said, well, just, you hold your hands together and you just pray. But it just felt, I don't know, it felt like something was missing. I was like not taught how to pray. And I did like this idea of that there is some type of movement, some type of way to pray. But I also found that way of praying comes with a danger. It comes with the danger of just falling into sort of pure mechanical praying. Like you're just doing the movements, you're not actually praying. And of course, Islam acknowledges this. It sort of tells you that, you need to, the importance of prayer is the very intent of that prayer. But I think it consumed me in the other way around, where I started easily facing the emptiness of that mechanical sort of doing of the prayers. And I couldn't find my way out of it. And I think also sort of saying the prayers in Arabic sort of caused a lot of disembodied praying. Even though I had memorized the prayers in Arabic, there was still this idea that it just wasn't my language. So it felt very disembodied. And on top of that, as a sort of convert in Islam, right, it is very hard to find a Muslim woman, because a lot of Muslim families want men that are within their language and culture. So yeah, being somebody that's out of that jurisdiction makes it very difficult. Makes it very difficult to, sort of be a part of the Islamic obligations and stuff. And I think that was kind of all those things sort of culminated in my decision to leave, I want to say. Um, but perhaps I still believe there might have been something more that I can't even really explain as such. But but it really gave me the beauty of Islam and the art and the Quran and everything else. I think if people sort of learned the way I did, it would really shed light on some of the misinterpretations and the mis ideas that they have about Islam. And I've had enough interaction with some Muslim women to say it's not Islam cannot be generalized the way it is usually generalized. It's very different across all cultures. I think that's very important to acknowledge. That sorry, Paul, you're muted.
Sorry, yeah. Would you say so? I mean, I've lived in Egypt for 9 months. I never went into a Muslim community at all, so I certainly haven't been as immersed as you have. I'd also say actually my experience was considerably more negative of that, that idea or the culture around it. And so I don't know, what would you say to like kind of, I've also seen statistics such as, a very large percentage or majority of Muslims, believe in the establishment of Sharia law, or maybe not a very large, but like a majority of Muslims believe in Sharia law, and kind of like, the establishment of a caliphate, and that these things are integrated, and the portrayal of women in the Quran, with Muhammad having, young girls as, a young girl as a kind of sex slave, this kind of thing. And looking also at the treatment of women in those societies, just seeing what it's like being a woman in Afghanistan. Do you feel that that's also very much misrepresented, or do you think those are also real issues in the religion itself? Are they systemic or what?
I think they're real issues. But I think the problem is that I think people have a hard time distinguishing between like cultural misogyny and misogyny that is apparently attributed to religion. Mm-hmm. Also, I mean, a lot of I could put it this way, that a lot of the notion of Islamic women is that a lot of the sort of typical, like, for example, the hijab, right? The hijab for maybe like us can look as something like oppressive and something in that way. It can be depicted as oppressive. Mm-hmm. But really the notion of hijab was supposed to be that women that wear the hijab sort of represent the piety they have towards God. That's it. There's really nothing else. Mm-hmm. The problem that we get is that it's the means. But unfortunately, there's a lot of people within that religion that sort of abuse the means and make it an end. For example, like, you're supposed to respect me because I'm your husband, and so on and so on. But actually, the whole point of husband and wife is that the reason why they function the way they function in sort of different ways is that everything is supposed to be aimed towards God. The man is always supposed to behave towards the woman as sort of towards God. But that easily gets, not, I mean, not everybody sort of behave towards God and sort of behave towards their desires. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that Islam is sort of culturally different. Like, for example, you're going to find a different Islam in Egypt. You're going to find a different Islam in Africa. You're going to find a different Islam in America. You're going to find a different Islam in so many different cultural areas that you could say, wherever you go, depending on where you go, you could say, this is what Islam is. And that's sort of the trouble. It's picking apart between the culture and the Islam. And I think sometimes the culture has penetrated so much of Islam that mm-hmm. the people that sort of get born into it can no longer distinguish what it actually is. Mm-hmm. And I think me as a person sort of coming into the religion, shows how, like, if you're taught the right way in some ways, and lucky I had good Muslims that sort of showed me, what it would mean and what it is that yeah, there's a lot of misrepresentation. Now the prophet and the child thing, that is sort of I guess it just depends what is a satisfactory answer for some people. For me, it was just a very like historical example of just like, actually a lot of, even if we look back at America and like, I think was it, I don't know, past, I think it's further back than the 1800s or something, where, you could marry a child that was like 10 or 11 or something of that sort.
Mary was probably around 12 years old when she married Joseph, or when she was married to Joseph as well. Like that was the norm for the time.
Yeah. And that's typically, but again, it may not be a satisfactory answer for some people, and it's totally understandable. For me, yeah, for me, it was historically, it was fine. I understood that historically they did that. I think, yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, yeah, I think Christianity is the same in that, like, if you look in every different country, there's, Christianity is very adaptable and very changeable. I think the view that I've seen in the Orthodox Church, so I'm a member of the Orthodox Church, is that Islam it's really kind of like a Christian heresy, or I think I heard someone explain, like it's kind of like you take all the Christian heresies, put them in one package, and then you could kind of come out with Islam. The idea that Christ is just a prophet, that's not something new with Islam, right? There was many Christian sects. I think Arianism was the first major heresy that was condemned at the Council of Nicaea, but that was basically saying that Christ was only more the Son of God than he was God. And so he was subordinate. He was a creation, not part of so in Christianity, you believe like Christ is uncreated. He's the kind of the first, the unmoved mover or something like that, or part of that Trinity, right? So yeah, but I think you're right that there's a lot of misunderstanding, and I think a lot of it is based on judging past times through kind of today's standards, which I think that leads to just total misunderstanding of the entire importance of religion and the function of religion in society and the way that it worked. And we look at practices like sacrifice and we think like, oh, that's completely insane and crazy, but actually we're doing the same thing in just weird and other dysfunctional unconscious ways ourselves in other areas of our lives. But I personally, I would also I do have as I said, I know less about Islam, but I do have a skepticism towards it. And I can also really appreciate how it's grounded in practice. So when you spoke about like getting into the mosque there, and there was no seats, and that's something that, so when I first came into an Orthodox Christian church, then the same thing, there's no seats. And so and this is really a product. When I look at it now, I see really like Western Christianity, it's all just about your like speaking to people's heads. So you get everybody seated down in these things, and then you entertain them with like some kind of concert up on a stage, and then you entertain them with a lecture by a charismatic speaker, and it's all just like trying to speak to their head, but their bodies are totally passive there. So in an Orthodox church, you're also standing up for up to 2-3 hours. Sometimes you're doing prostrations, and which I think a lot of people think, oh, like when you're prostrating and putting your head down to the ground, like this is a Muslim thing. But actually, this was a Christian practice long before it was a Muslim practice. It's just that we stopped doing it in the West, but it's still an integral part of Orthodox practice as well, right? So yeah, this kind of grounding in practice. My wife wears head covering when we're in church and when we pray together as a family as well. We have morning prayers, evening prayers every single day, and she wears a head covering on her head, because this is again seen as it's a biblical principle as well. And for me, it has a very practical thing, which I think can also again be misrepresented. We live in a culture where women should be like welcome to dress as sexily and as provocatively as they want in every single circumstance, also in the workplace. I worked for several years for a very large multinational corporation, where a woman there at my work would come through with a completely see-through top, no bra, in kind of like some kind of designer model thing. She was very much connected to the model world as well. And you just kind of like you just have to accept these things. But it's like, do you think this is not affecting her boss or like her co-employees as like you're working with her, right? So it's like, you know, and like the whole purpose of makeup and, you know, high heels and stuff like that is to increase sexual attraction, and men are influenced by this kind of thing, right? So it's like this function of like, when you're in a place of spiritual worship, that the women cover their hair. Well, I noticed that when they don't do that, like it draws my attention. And so the whole purpose of the spiritual practice is the focusing of attention on that which is higher, and training ourselves to control that attention. You mentioned this function of discipline as well, right? Which is absolutely necessary. So I think for me, I really understand this attraction to Islam, which is very much based on just the utter poverty of a lot of what goes along by the name of Christianity, which is what I grew up with as well, and what I rejected for my entire adult life until, you know, about 4 or 5 years ago, in my late 30s, where I suddenly kind of realized like, oh, there's something missing here as well. So
yeah, and to kind of give you like an example to sort of echo your point, like a lot of the controversy with Islam, you know, about sort of oppressing women, is that when you go in the mosque, a lot of the women will either be separated from the men or sort of pray behind the men. And for a lot of like, maybe a lot of progressive Muslims, they might see like this as sort of like oppressive. But I mean, I do think if you think about the sort of like the whole point of worship is that, and if you think about what Muslims have to do to sort of, when they're praying, you know, you have to sort of bend over and do all these repetitive acts. That, you know, I've talked to some Islamic scholars and say like, you know, having a woman, if you were to sort of line up with other men, it could be distracting to another man if there's a woman sort of bending over in front of you while she's sort of doing the acts of prayer. And of course, like, you should behave, but at the same time, you know, I think a lot of the Muslims are sort of wary of this idea of like, I think in my opinion, they really relish in the idea of sort of your sole focus should be the divine, and anything that sort of causes that distraction from your focus of the divine needs to be sort of deterred, needs to be prevented. And I think the problem with Islam is that if we start talking about it in a secular society, if you don't believe in a God, then you're right, Islam is just misogynist. You know, if there's no point in believing in that sort of divine element that they believe in, then, you know, it is misogynist. That's it. Because if you don't believe in a God, then what they're doing is pointless. They have no, you know, the women should have no reason to be in the back. But I think there's a problem in that thinking, and sort of saying that if the women are in the back, that sort of says that they are in an inferior position. I got confused about that point of like, if women are in the back, they're in a, like, that always automatically assumes they're in an inferior position. It could mean, and I think another way of interpreting that is it could mean that men are so weak they have to be in the front. You know, like, sort of, for example, like if you have friends in a classroom and they're sort of misbehaving, they're always in the back. But in order to sort of fix that behavior, you have to sort of bring them to the front and sort of separate them.
Yeah, well, there could be something like that. You know, so most Orthodox churches have women on the left, men on the right.
Really?
That's what we have in my churches. Some churches are far more relaxed about it, and so you'll often have people going from one side to the other. But certainly, like, the thing was like doing prostrations directly behind a woman, you know, that's distracting, obviously, you know, like to you know, so yeah, that's the normal thing, and especially you'll see that in monasteries and stuff like that, is that they'll separate them side by side. But yeah, I think there's a more fundamental point, which is also, you know, hierarchies are a natural way of organizing. I think Islam has a very basic, correct understanding of hierarchy, which is that, you know, the masculine principle is that which is above and imparts that which is below. So the masculine is what represents heaven, and the feminine is that which represents earth. And so the divine is the meeting of heaven and earth, right? And this is, I think, in common to Christianity and Islam, but there's nothing, you know, you need heaven and you need earth. That, like, this is an important principle, and so you can't just have one or the other, but I think Christianity certainly has that exact same thing. So Christ was a man. The greatest human that ever lived was the mother of Christ, which was Mary, right? And that was a woman. So she is the highest example of a human being that we can follow. What did she do? Well, she said, let it be done to me according to your will, right? So it was a very humble attitude of submission, which is also a central principle, of course, in Islam, is this idea of submission to that which is greater, to that which is good, the source of all good, right? So I think it's a beautiful idea that makes a lot of sense. And then obviously there's really important differences between Christianity and Islam as well, about who Christ was and what he did, and how, I think for me it's also like the establishment of what is power on earth, what is authority on earth, and Islam, I would say, would tend to mix kind of secular authority and power with spiritual authority and power, whereas Christ, the last thing he said before he ascended is like, all authority on heaven and earth is given unto me. But what does that authority look like? Well, it works on a different time scale, because Christ, he basically gave himself to be murdered, killed by the strongest empire in the entire world. And by doing that, actually defeated that empire. It took 400 years, right? Or 320 years or something like that. But then, took over, established himself as the most powerful authority on earth. But it took a very long time for that to happen. But he did it through complete humility, and complete surrender, almost, actually. So he surrendered himself, so it was an act of pure love, with no force or anything like that, especially no physical use of force, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jesus is probably one of the most interesting, like, just characters to just like, when we look even like at the Abrahamic faith in general, like Judaism and Islam, it's interesting that sort of Judaism sort of rejects Jesus, but you could say for Islam, like for the Christian, Islam doesn't go far enough with Jesus, right? It's sort of just Jesus is just a prophet. But then I will say what I admire about Christianity is that if you understand Christianity correctly, it teaches you how to embody paradox. The very idea of being man, being God. I still love the way Schuon sort of represents, even though he's a perennialist and that may cause some disruption, but I really do love the way Schuon talks about Christianity, because the way he talks about Christianity, and he really pins it down, in my opinion, why maybe Islam might have a problem with Christianity, or why Judaism might have a problem with Christianity, is that Christianity is the only religion in the Abrahamic faith that has an esoteric principle that is not hidden. It is completely manifest. Where typically you'd have to do some type of, you'd have to know the secrets, the more esoteric practices of the religion, but Christianity doesn't have that. Jesus is, you could say, the esoteric principle that is manifest, that is man and God. And for me, I mean, once I understood this, I thought it was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I mean, this breaks down so much, you could say, misrepresentation. This breaks down so much. And then also the Trinity, if you really study it, and because, for a while, I think a lot of the Muslim arguments convinced me, because it was like, a Muslim could rationally be like, okay, so tell me how, I remember watching this video on YouTube, the Muslim would say, okay, so you have the Trinity, right? The Christian would be like, okay, yeah. He's like, okay, so the Father divine, the Spirit divine, but Jesus divine and man. He's like, explain to me how they're all co-equal and co-eternal and something like that, of that sort. And I was just like, oh, yep, we got him. There's a contradiction there or something like that, But anyways, what I learned that is difficult about the Trinity is that it's hard for us to think opposites without negation. What the Christianity teaches you is that you can have opposites, but it is distinction, which is very subtle from negation. It's distinction. And I thought that was such a useful concept and such a beautiful concept. This idea of distinction rather than negation of opposites. It's very hard to think opposites. How do you unite opposites without negation?
Mhm.
And I think Christianity and the Trinity does that. It really teaches you how to think through that.
Mhm.
But of course, most Christians, you could say, just sort of know what the Trinity is. They say they can just sort of spew out, some of the
They
just the
might know a little bit of
creeds.
the creed or something like
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
right?
they might
Or
just
maybe not even that, but they have
yeah,
some idea
but
of like
but they
what.
don't understand the metaphysical value of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think
Or just like how incredibly crazy and world changing everything that Christ represents is, and how just like, how it flipped everything on its head, and how when Christ first said, to his disciples, like, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part in me. Like people were like, what the hell is this guy crazy, right? Like that made no sense. And then today we're just like, oh yeah, we could do this communion thing as Christians, but like that's just like this, like it's been sucked dry of all kind of its actual meaning for a lot of people. We've become blunted to it somehow or something like that. I don't really know, but I can, speaking for myself, I was completely blunted to the whole of Christianity and didn't understand any of the sacredness of it at all. It become like this dry materialist kind of thing that you just had to believe in these set of things like God created the world and Jesus, he had walked on water and and this kind of stuff, right? And so there was none of that nuance and complexity that so when I kind of was introduced to atheist ideas, then a lot of the time atheists, and I imagine it sounds like this Muslim video you had as well, they kind of like they contend with very shallow ideas of Christianity in a lot of ways, right? And then when you shoot those down, then it's like, okay, now the whole thing's fallen for you, and so then you one goes into or yeah. So I don't know. It's hard to understand how to bring this back. I think a lot of people have. You mentioned like a long time back or some time back, like some anger towards Christianity. I was very angry with Christianity for a long time. I went around like telling people why I thought religion and Christianity was like one of the worst things that ever happened to society, and there was no value from it whatsoever, and things like that, right? And so it took me a long time to realize how that had switched around. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why. I mean, I think that's why I kind of maybe fell into perennialism. Like I read some of Schuon's stuff just a little bit here and there, and something that he said like really pointed out to me about like he's like, if you hate any specific religion, you probably should spend time in that religion. And that I think, and when I realized that, I was like, yeah, I think that's exactly what I've been doing. I've been spending time with just things I didn't understand. I mean, it's totally different. And I think this is what I couldn't accept when I was sort of going through some of the religions, was that I couldn't accept just sort of just argumentative statements about the other religions or anything, because there was just a gap, and I couldn't explain, but there's just a crucial gap between when I would talk to people that wanted to talk to me about their own religion and tell me about it and teach me about it. It was a completely different experience. And even though it's like maybe you couldn't sort out some of the claims about, well, this religion is this way and that's why I'm not in this religion and so on. I've met, I guess you could say I was fortunate to meet a lot of nice Muslims. And I remember an old Muslim one time pulled me to the side. He said, I just want to let you know that Muslims, even though they try to represent Islam, never truly represent Islam. He's like, I just want to let you know that. They will always fall short of that ideal. And so he said, he's like, you just try to do the best Islam that you know. And that sort of just, that little interaction with that old Muslim man just sort of really shifted my perspective. And sometimes there's a lot of accusations about Islam, and sometimes I feel motivated to sort of defend or sort of disperse some of the misrepresentations, just because there is still like a love for that religion, and there's a lot of love that I have for all the other religions as well. but I do think some of these misrepresentations cause a lot of havoc and hatred that is not always deserved. So
it's far easier to create a collective identity in a group of people by defining an enemy, right? And so people these days are, I guess people all the time have really needed to, or for various reasons, wanted to establish more strong collective identities. I think right now we see a war going on in Ukraine because people are realizing like, well, there's nothing holding us together anymore, so let's start a war so that we can stick together and like at least have something we can fight against together. So and I think that's probably going to continue, and people use all kinds of reasons, you know, ethnicity and religion being core ones that they'll use. I really agree. Like, you know, I think whatever system of faith you're coming in, but certainly I actually just heard an Orthodox priest saying recently, you know, like, whatever you come from, then, you know, appreciate all the good that come from that's from there. You know, if you look at the history of Christianity, it didn't come in and dominate and destroy pagan religions when it came into Europe, or, you know, wherever it came in. It actually just incorporated them. That's why Christianity is full of, you know, like adapted pagan stuff. So there was plenty of stuff, you know, even like, so I live in Denmark, you know, and in Viking mythology, and, you know, Odin was hung on a tree and he was there for 3 days, and he was like, yeah, what do you have? I think he had an iron, you know, there's all this kind of like stuff that points towards Christ. There was foreshadowing of Christ everywhere in paganism. You'll find Christ-like figures in so many different of pagan stories, right? So you know, there's no reason, and this is, I think, a problem with like the modernist, you know, Christianity is like, if it's not in the Bible, then it's evil and demonic or something like that, right? It's like, this is a bad misunderstanding. I wouldn't go as far. So perennialism, in case someone's watching, I mean, I don't know if everybody knows what that is, but I understand it as like, it's you're looking for the kind of overarching truths from all religious systems, or something like that, and you're trying to identify like common threads and shared themes and value you can get from all of them. Is that a
I mean, a lot of, like, you could say my current perennialist take is probably not the most, probably wouldn't be a popular one, and probably would be an unheard of one. I'm constantly reforming the perennialist idea. I think a lot of the arguments recently that, in my opinion, has kind of just been like a waste of time is like, you know, if you, for example, they spend so many years like arguing over like the mystical experience from various religions to sort of like prove that there is this sort of transcendent unity. I'm not in favor of that idea. I don't think that we should be arguing about mystical experiences to sort of prove some sort of transcendent anything. I sort of approach it in the idea of that perennialism doesn't ask you to leave your religion. That it doesn't ask you to leave your religion at all. But there is this idea that if you sort of become, like, you could say, if you go through the religion itself, if you go through being the best Christian that you are, being the best Buddhist or Muslim or so on, there is this idea that is sort of universal, that you know, you could say that there is something beyond that. Like, I always look at religion as a sort of means to have a relationship with the divine, and if we look at it that way, then in my opinion there is a case that can be said that the relationship with the divine is automatically already sort of above or sort of beyond religion itself, but the religion is sort of there to sort of prepare you and sort of cultivate you for those means. Now, it's very much the case that not everybody has those means, or not everybody is sort of capable of sort of shooting beyond that, and so it is very understandable to sort of be either caught up in the exoteric side, you know, just sort of being like a regular Christian or a regular Muslim, and just sort of doing the things that you think is true and divine and so on. And I think, actually, in my opinion, you don't have to accept perennialism at all, because in my opinion, a lot of religions already have mechanisms that are universal in its place. For example, and for me, in my opinion, I would call these sort of almost perennial mechanisms, but they are inside the religion itself. For example, in Christianity, it's love your neighbor. You don't loving your neighbor, you know, obviously it obviously involves, I mean, at least I feel like it involves somebody that's outside of your religion, somebody that's doesn't believe in God. So there's already like this universal mechanism within Christianity. Same thing with Buddhism, sort of love all sentient beings, right? This sort of cultivating these principles that are sort of universal, in my opinion, kind of point to a sort of perennialist idea. But again, I'm very cautious about the perennialist idea because I find it very dangerous, because what I don't want is I don't want somebody to sort of listen to this and be like, okay, well, if all these religions are from the same source, then I'm just going to, willy-nilly pick one and then just sort of go about my day. No, there's something.
Well, even worse is kind of create your own personal patchwork of ideas from all kinds of different religions, and then you can use that to rationalize basically anything that you want, because what you ultimately then do is you place yourself above all of these religions, and then you establish the religion of me, which is basically the dominant religion of our society as well. So that's what everything is pointing towards, or pushing us towards, at least from the culture these days, right? Yeah.
Exactly, and that is why I'm very much adamant about we cannot have a cheap universalism. It has to be universalism that requires work, and that's why I always kind of like Schuon, because Schuon was more, you could say, a traditionalist. You could not even access the idea of perennialism if you weren't sort of already in the religion itself. So I mean, of course, there's disagreements, but at the same time, what I like about the idea is that one, it's not asking you to leave your religion. It's sort of kind of doing this, you could say, some type of comparison where it's saying that there is something in common about us all. And of course, the most broad common is that we're all humankind, we're all in the likeness of God, and so on. But that interpretation is different. I think a lot of my work has been on the idea of predisposition. I've been taking the notion of predisposition or spiritual disposition kind of very seriously. This is something that the perennialists kind of provoke. There's something about our spiritual predisposition that sort of attracts us to certain things and certain ideas about the divine, which is something that I'm still trying to work through. I do think there is some credibility to that idea, and I do feel like for atheists. And I do think there is a way out for atheists, in the sense of that atheism is already rooted in, the atheism was already rooted in Buddhism, right? So if you are naturally an atheist, I feel like Buddhism would actually be the answer for an atheist.
I also believe there's a strong predisposition in atheism towards just like rebelling against father figures and authority figures. So it's like you can also, instead of like going to Buddhism, you can also just like resolve like that you probably have an issue with your dad, and if you figure that out, then you could probably also figure out like approaching God as well. And it'd probably be even more valuable than just going into, because Buddhism is really just the worship of nothingness or emptiness or something like that, right? So you just replace a father figure with an emptiness figure or something like that. That's at least a very simplified, basic way. I'm sure would provoke a whole lot of Buddhists. But
well, I mean, the one thing that's beneficial about Buddhism is that it teaches you this concept of like non-attachment, or what we would call, like what Saint Francis calls like holy indifference. Yeah. You could say it. So it's that this cultivating of like, and this is the part where I still kind of fall into my perennialist tendencies, because from in my experience of like a lot of the mystics are not so much entertained about their specific religion. They're very much entertained about the divine itself, the relationship with the divine. Yeah. And they, of course, they express it differently, but they're just very adamant about that expression. I think Sholem talks about this idea of conservative mystics and revolutionary mystics. The conservative mystics sort of try to maintain and add to the religion itself, but the rebellious mystics, you could say, these are the heretics. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about what is the function of heresy, rather than just sort of just this mere deviation. But I think there is some real function to heresy, because for the Jews, Jesus is a heretic. he's a Jewish heretic for the Jews, And then, like, as you
Well,
pointed
I
out
guess
further,
Jews are all they're confronted with a choice, right? Like, I mean, you can look at how much Christ fulfilled all the prophecies of the Old Testament, right? And how modern day Judaism is basically defined as a reaction. Even Jews, like Jewish scholars, will confirm, like, modern day Judaism is defined as a reaction against Christ, actually, so they've like tried to find a way of defining themselves, but it's still, based on those ideas. So anyway, okay, I want to bring things a little bit together now, because we've gone on for a good deal. So yeah, I mean, I thought it's really fascinating. You're working as a medical secretary, you're going back to school. I saw something about plants and wanting to stop this kind of like, this swinging back and forth of like treatments and counter treatment kind of thing, and find a natural way. And then I think that's mirrored maybe a little bit in our conversation here, about trying to bring together, and certainly you're on this journey as well, right? Yeah, I don't know, what would be could you see a parallel there in what you're wanting to study and what you're searching for with your spiritual search? I don't know if I'm pushing too hard now for some kind of metaphor.
no, you're good. I was thinking about, your whole concept about this idea of like life in transition, and I really did have a crisis with my own identity. And basically, I got obsessed with like Carl Jung, and I tried to, find myself, and through this shadow work and so on. You could say I sort of fell into the sort of pop Jungian psychology that Instagram and Facebook sort of just screams from above. And this is what I know Cadell hates about sort of Jungian notions. But anyways, yeah, I feel I actually, what sort of healed my psychotic like breakdown of my identity was that I read this poem from Emily Dickinson, where she just said, she's like, who am I? I am nothing. And then, the poem just continues about how she's nothing, she's no one, and that you actually shouldn't tell anybody that you're no one. Because the moment that you tell somebody that you're no one, you actually already identifying yourself. You're already throwing some identity. And I think this has just been a metaphor for the rest of my life, and going into transition, where I'm constantly confronting the death of my own self. And I think studying religions and sort of going through these phases of my life is that I'm always ready to encounter a new death of God, so to speak. That I think this is perhaps, I mean, there's always argument against it, but my personal experience is that studying different religions, going through transitions, is that whatever concept of God that I have has always been ready on the table to die. And I'm not going to act like that's easy. It has been very difficult. It has been hard to swallow some concepts that I just want to disagree with. I've really put myself in a position where anytime I have a certain conception of God, is just ready for its slaughterhouse. And this has completely shaped me, in my opinion. That, you could say it's almost like a little Nietzschean kind of notion, where it's like the moment I value something, you get ready to sort of know that it's void of also a value. But it's funny that, you could talk about this sort of nihilistic tendency, but at the same time, this sort of process of going through the death of God constantly, and changing your concept and ideas, is that actually this is the value in itself.
Yeah, and I mean, one can look at that as a nihilistic Nietzschean concept, but one can also just see it as, well, this is the definition that Christians have always had of God, actually. And so I think actually the connection that I heard you guys talking with my talk from Cadell, was me quoting, I think this comes from St. Maximus the Confessor, but it even goes further back. St. John of Damascus also said this is in the 2nd century, where basically they say, I think the quote is something along the lines of like, it would be better to say that God does not exist, because any definition of God would place him in the realm of things, which he does not inhabit that realm at all. So it's actually more accurate to say in that way, it's thinking of God as within a kind of, so this is called the apophatic definition, right? Which is also not seen as contradictory to the kagophatic definition, which, giving God all kinds of qualities. And I think Jordan Peterson does an amazing job at like, giving all kinds of concepts of God. But at the end of the day, like all of them need to dissolve because, as you say, like, you know, we need to be able to sacrifice these ideas all the time because none of them are at all able to encapture an experience, a proper experience of the divine, right? Our language is always going to fall short, but without that belief, and I think it's fascinating, you know, when you said like, you know, you had that experience of like you were in your barracks and you're just thinking of taking your own life, and it's like there's got to be something more to this, and yeah, I think that I certainly can see how I filled up my life. The more I could feel that feeling lurking underneath the surface, then I filled up with my life with more and more and more stuff, and then yeah, at some time it kind of caught up with me as well, and then I needed to deal with it. Something like
yeah,
that.
and I think this is some of my own work that I've done. I've actually done some work on some written work on like suicide, like on my own like Substack and stuff, because I've personally experienced, and the biggest problems in the army was suicide, you know, suicide and other stuff.
Really?
But yeah, suicide is very prominent in the army, and the army is trying to do things to solve it. But I think with myself, I found that it was this notion of who I thought I was, and when I would confront the idea that it was transient, it was horrifying, really. Like, you know, you could say you're encountering this void, this nothingness, and it's frightening. But what I found was that I think, I mean, at least this is my current interpretation of suicide, and it's not I don't want to generalize it because I know there can be some real illnesses that can contribute to the idea of suicide. But I want to say that I think it's the notion that we have of ourselves, and that suicide, if we look at it as a mechanism that sort of begs, we could say, redemption, or sort of begs a rebirth. I think one of my favorite sayings that a psychologist said, it said, when you say that you want to kill yourself, what part of you wants to die? And I think that really, really, really brought it into perspective for me, because I think suicide as a mechanism actually functions in that way. It is actually asking you, what parts of you wants to die? What parts of you already wants to sort of go through this rebirth? And sort of, yeah.
That's a fascinating idea because, I mean, you know, so basically the model that Christ set was self-sacrifice. It was self-sacrifice, right? But it's in a metaphysical sense, I guess, to a certain extent, but it's also in a very practical sense of self-sacrifice. And so seeing, one could say suicide is in some ways a reaction against a culture which says, no, it's all about just like feeding yourself and it's all about like loving yourself or something like that, right? That's the key to everything like that. It's like, and I think, you know, there's something about self-acceptance, I think, I think that needs to go along with self-sacrifice. You know, you can't, but when people talk these days about self-love, for me, it's just, it doesn't work. Love is an irrational driving towards something. It's eros, right? It's this kind of like completely passionate. So if you turn that towards yourself, for me, that's a short circuiting of what's a natural, you know, ultimately one should love God, right? Then that'll drive you higher towards the heavens. This is like the Plato's idea of like, you know, the chariot being driven up towards the heavens. And so I think that when I think you do self-love, then I think then there's something inside of you that knows like no self-sacrifice. So that's the right way of being. So maybe you're right. That is it a new thing that the army has this problem with suicide, or has this always existed in militaries? Do you know more about that? Actually,
I can't say that much for the history, but I mean, I want to say it feels more prominent now, but it could just be like, you know, technology and sort of our, you know, sort of how everything is sort of universally communicated now. But yeah, it seems prominent, and I think that's why I did this sort of spiritual turn, because I mean, if I was going to be honest, if I didn't have that, I probably would have a drinking problem. I would, you know, I don't know how I would have turned out. I just know that it wouldn't have been good. And it, you know, I'm not gonna lie, a lot of people that I was with, and you know, that I feel like my comrades, you know, they drink a lot. You know, they drink a lot. They don't know how to handle certain things. They don't know what to do. And I think the moment they come across a sort of identity crisis, the only logical point or step is suicide. And even veterans suffer this idea as well. I mean, it's a big identity crisis. If you become a veteran, you don't have your support system anymore. You're done. And it's just not the same. The civilians can't relate to your lingo and your language. They don't know the experience that you've had. And you could say this, for me, this foundation that I have of, theology and so on, it has really solidified my identity in terms of like, I can always let go of my identity and let it die. It's okay. I can do this because the object of my identity, that you could say my identity is predicated on the object of my worship. And I got this idea ironically from Freud, where he talks about how the libido always attaches itself to an object, and that this object can be so invested in the libido that the object actually can momentarily replace your ego. And I thought, wow, this is beautiful. I mean, this is perfect. I mean, it shows how easily nihilism is you can fall into nihilism, right? You can say nihilism is predicated
on the worship of the abyss or something like that, right?
Yeah, you can say nihilism is predicated on the object of your worship, because you can see how void, how valueless it really is. And the only thing that sustained me was God. Really, that was the only source that I could find that didn't just like completely annihilate me. It felt like, I mean, it annihilated me, but it annihilated me in a good way.
Yeah, death is inevitable. It's just how you go about it. And if you try and, what does Christ say? That if you will keep your life, then you will lose it. And if you will lose your life for my sake, then you will gain it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, beautiful idea. Okay, Javier, thank you very much. That's been a fantastic conversation. It's gone on longer than I promised or intended as well. But I really enjoyed that. So thanks so much. And really appreciate you coming on and sharing openly and honestly. I'm going to put the link for your channel on the description for this video. Do you want to, and anything else that you want to, where people can find you, check you out, or anything like that? Yeah.
No, I mean, that's it. I mean, it's just Javier Rivera. And, I talk about perennialism stuff, my new formulations of perennialism, or, my Ibn Arabi book club that I run. And those are some interesting ideas from an Islamic mystic thinker. So, if people are interested in that, they can watch it. And other than that, I have some other stuff. I do some dating philosophy, YouTube stuff. I think that's initially what attracted Cadell to me.
The dating philosophy.
Yeah. Because I was showing like how void, the dating life is, and
give us a little teaser on your dating philosophy, like what are your ground principles that you're using to engage with that, and then we'll leave it for there as a little advert or a teaser for people who might want to go check it out.
So one of my favorite things to sort of like conceptualize when we talk about dating and sort of like falling in love is that we approach dating already from a notion of lack, correct? But all of a sudden, when we start engaging with the person, all of a sudden we start feeling like fulfilled and stuff. But it doesn't make any sense, because we were both empty sort of vessels when we met each other. How was it that all of a sudden that we're not lacking? And sort of I do this sort of philosophical exploration where I'm saying that actually there's no way that it is possible that we actually possess love in itself. It's just not possible, because we're already, the way we meet each other is this lacking. And we just don't know how to sort of confront that lacking and what we do with it. And that's why I do very much like the Christian notion of the idea that love is not this sort of just emotion. It is this act of the will. And there's something to be said about that, and sort of commitment. And I've also been working on ideas about this idea of like indifference, where a lot of people, when we try to date, we try to find more commonality than difference. We don't like difference. We sort of feel very resistance against difference. But actually, to be in difference is that actually healthy relationship with difference. And that's some of my like thinking, and that's some of what what Cadell got attracted to, is this idea of the sort of us being in difference, and sort of know that we are lacking individuals, and there's no way that it's possible that I can get my soul satisfaction from my partner because she herself is also lacking. So how is it that, where is this actual satisfaction coming from? And so it really points to, it's very hard for me not to point to theology and some type of divine thing at that point. But
yeah, I have no idea how people make relationships work without having the divine in the relationship. Like, I'm like amazed by those people that they could, because me and my wife, we would never manage it without, like, we both of us, we say, like, God is in our relationship, like, he needs to be there. Otherwise, there needs to be a concept of something higher, because if you're just two people looking at each other like this and trying to get closer to each other, it's not going to work, because it's just two completely different people that we can't actually approach each other. But when we look upwards, like, then we can, like, get close to each other that way, right? By agreeing on, well, what's up here? And that's long conversations about the details of it, right? Like, what is it that you're actually trying to head towards? And if we can envision that future together, then we can move towards it as well.
And that's why I feel like some of the feminist critiques against Christianity really fall short, because I'm like, okay, we have to be really, really careful here, because Christianity claims that once you're married, you become one flesh. So it can't fall to a solely critique of, like, what the role of the woman is and what the role of the man is. The metaphor is already inherent in Christianity. It's this idea of that when man and woman come together, they become one flesh. So it is not possible to critique what that actually sort of manifests itself. It's the way that you guys function together. And in my opinion, the only way to sort of reconcile opposites is by having a third. And it's exactly like the way you pointed it out, is by you both sort of looking up, sort of discussing at the top about what that is.
Yeah, someone said that the way to integrate a paradox is in a person. It's the only way a paradox can be integrated is in a person. So yeah, that's it's a deep idea. Javier, thank you very much for the talk. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
All the best.